This is the newly revised Buyer Representation and Broker Compensation Agreement, Form BRBC. You'll see it's the 1224 revision, released today, December 18th, 2024, and this is the version I imagine we'll be using for at least the next 6 months. Now, there is a new provision added that's dangerous and must be avoided. So I'll show you where to find it and how to avoid it. I'll also show you how to fill this out properly because doing so will prevent a lot of headache and heartache in the future. Now, this is part of a bundle, and it starts with a disclosure regarding real estate agency relationship at the top. We've all seen this form. Both you and your client are going to sign it. Nothing to do on page 2. And we arrive at the actual representation agreement. We start by putting the date we're drafting the form up here on the top left, the name of our client or clients here, then the name of our brokerage, and we come down to the representation period. Now, there's a beginning and an ending date. Both of these must be filled out if one or both are blank. This could be potentially unenforceable. Your client could potentially nullify this form. So make sure you have both a beginning and ending date on this form, and that the ending date does not exceed 3 months from the beginning date. This whole term must not exceed 3 months. Okay, type of representation. By default, if you do nothing here, it's non-exclusive. However, I advocate for exclusive. Now, on the past version, there were issues because exclusive meant the buyer had to wait 30 days after canceling, and there was some drawbacks to it, but those have largely been removed, and I'll show you later in the form. So there's not much that the buyer has to compromise by doing exclusive, but let me explain how it protects you as an agent. Imagine this. So you're working for a buyer, and you're working on spec in anticipation that you will get paid when you eventually close a transaction, but you're doing all this work and there's no retainer, you're not being paid for it. Now, your buyer that you do all this work for could, in theory, go into an open house and have the agent hosting the open house write an offer, maybe even working for weeks with this buyer or months. And then all of a sudden they walk into an open house and another agent writes an offer there on the spot for them. If you're non-exclusive, you're out of luck. You just got cut out. You lose. You did all that work and you get nothing out of it. If it's exclusive, they must use you. They can't just wander into an open house on an off day after you've put in a ton of work and have some other agent write an offer. But it's up to you. You do it this how you want. I personally advocate for exclusive. Now, property type. By default, this is for single family, residential, and condos and manufactured homes. If you do nothing here, that's what's included. If you want to exclude single family residential for some reason I can't even imagine, check this box. And if you want to include other types of property like multifamily or land or commercial, check the appropriate boxes here. If you want to just put in maybe one property address, maybe this whole form is centered upon just one property, check this box and write that in here. Okay. Location. Now, they have it broken down into counties and cities. You want to keep it as broad of a geographic area that you can reasonably service, because if you go too broad, a buyer could contest this form and say you trapped them into an area that you as an agent couldn't reasonably service. So that's why you don't want to put something where, multiple counties, multiple large counties, LA County, Riverside County, Orange County. That's too broad for someone to reasonably conduct their real estate duties. So you also don't want to be too narrow either. If you just put one city, but the buyer ends up purchasing in a neighboring city, that's bad too. So put the widest area that you can reasonably service when you fill this out. Additional description, if you need to add something extra, well, there's a space for it. This is kind of like a filler. I don't see a need for it, but if you ever have to add something, you can put it in. Now, I wouldn't check this box if I were filling this out for my own use. I did, however, check this box because it adds another form to the bundle, and I want to show you for the sake of an example. Basically, it just identifies additional preferences and priorities for the buyer. So I personally wouldn't add it, but I'll show you what it looks like in case you see need for it and how you do your own business. Now, do you need to exclude any properties? So this is the case I would use. Properties excluded from representation is if I took over a buyer that was working with another buyer's agent. And there were properties in which that other agent had quote unquote broker involvement. That's the key term mentioned in this form. Because if there were other properties in which another agent had broker involvement, they're the brokerage entitled to the commission. So that can be identified here. If you're bringing someone that has a history with another agent, that can be identified here. All right, compensation. So you'll want to put in an amount, and I talked about this in my last tutorial on this form, but you don't want to put a small number just to meet the requirement. I mean, this is not only in California is this a realtor requirement, but it's a legal requirement starting in a couple weeks. State law requires everyone to do this form or an equivalent representation agreement. And if you put too low of a number, that's the most you can make in a transaction. So you should put a higher number. And I've explained before that now, if a buyer says, well, what if a seller doesn't reimburse me the entire amount? There's ways to waive it, okay? You can just do a modification of terms and change this after the fact to 2.5% or 2%. But you can't do it up front. I mean, you can't make some agreement that says, hey, I'll only charge you what a seller's willing to pay. That's not allowed. It must be definitive. So that's why we just put a number here as a placeholder, and the number should be what you are hoping to get paid. It should be a real number, 2 to 3%. Now, you could also do an attach broker or a broker created compensation schedule and attach it and check this box. But again, if you have some made up form where the figures are non-definitive, meaning it's like, if X, then Y compensation, and if Y, then Z compensation, that can be nullified, that can be unenforceable, and may potentially have legal issues now that this is state law. So don't do that. It must be definitive. It must be crystal clear. And if you need to make changes, it can be done on other forms in the future. All right, now this just says that basically any compensation received by the buyer's agent from, let's say, the seller, like the seller concession, that's credited toward this amount. So when you're explaining this form to the buyer, you can say, look, any money I receive offsets your obligation to me. It gets deducted from this amount that you're pledging to pay me here. It gets deducted on whatever I receive from anyone else. Now, there is a provision here that I think is a mistake that C.A.R made. Brokers shall not receive any amount in excess of paragraph 2E1. They left out one key term. Shame on them. They should have said for buyer representation. There should have been a mention of that, because this could create an issue with dual agency. So that's another topic for another time. I might deep dive that one thing. I don't want to cause alarm now, but I do not like that this exists out there in the realm, because it creates a technical issue that could, in a rare scenario, come up. Now, continuation. What happens if your client cancels and then the next day they change their mind and decide to purchase a property that you showed them? Well, this protects you. There's a 30-day period in which any property that you did or there was broker involvement, you still get paid. This is to protect you from you doing work and someone cutting you out, and then 5 days after cancellation or expiration of the agreement, you're still compensated if they decide to proceed with the property in which you were involved. So I think 30 days is a reasonable time frame, but it's entirely up to you how long you want as a continuation period. Now, cancellation rights. So non-exclusive, people can cancel immediately, effective upon receipt. Now, that can be delayed. Or exclusive cancellation, and there's that 30 days we're talking about. Remember before how I said that on an exclusive cancellation, there's a 30-day waiting period, which kind of stinks actually for both the agent and the buyer. That can be reduced by putting a number in here. You know what's funny is when they made this form or added this form to the forms manager, the software, they don't have this fillable here. So that would likely have to get added after you fill out this form on your manager. But you could just put 0, and which makes it, or 1. They may require a number. You could put a period there probably. But either way, the point is that you can eliminate that waiting period if you want, which is probably the biggest pushback from the cancellation of an exclusive, or biggest pushback of doing an exclusive. But now you can get rid of it and say, no, exclusive? No, we're exclusive, but you can cancel any time. Just make sure you have that continuation period in there to protect you, okay? All right, and then buyer to deliver their personal information. So this you can, in theory, actually whittle down because a buyer should give you a proof of funds. You should ask a buyer for a pre-qualification letter if they're getting a mortgage and a copy of their proof of funds for the down payment and to pay you, because there's a problem that, and I made another video, go to my channel and see what I have said about the Department of Real Estate and their newest advisory that just came out. They had to do an update because it sent everyone into a frenzy, but basically the Department of Real Estate in California said there's a scenario in which a buyer could be negotiating a property and excuse their agent from the transaction because they don't have sufficient funds. Well, all that stems on this sort of nonsense right here. This is the poison pill that I warned you about in the beginning of the video. This line here, G2, buyer does not have sufficient funds to pay broker. Okay, then why are they hiring someone? Why are they hiring a professional service if they don't have the money to pay for it? Okay, and it says, buyer broker's obligation to represent buyer in a transaction is contingent upon seller's agreement to pay the amount of compensation, effectively contingent upon the seller picking up the tab. Okay, no, I don't think so. Now, the way that transactions are structured, sellers are picking up the tab. I mean, that's how it works. But you don't want to be in a position where the buyer, so this is all subjective, because a buyer can make an offer and exhaust all the money that they have, all the cash that they have for a down payment or even a cash purchase, and say, we have just enough for the sales price, but not enough to pay you. So bye-bye. That's why you should never, ever, ever check this box here. And you should have a proof of funds that you get within 5 days, or you can shorten it up. You can tell the buyer, listen, any offer we send, we need a proof of funds and a pre-qualification letter if they're getting a mortgage. You need that to submit an offer. So why wouldn't you ask for that when you're working as their representative showing homes if they're pledging to pay you? The buyer's on the hook for this amount until a seller offers to pick up the tab. Do not check this box here. I'm telling you, there is no logical reason to check this box. And I will debate anyone on this. There is absolutely no circumstance ever, not even a rare one, in which this box should be checked. This whole line should be eliminated from this form. Avoid it like the plague, okay? I'm just telling you right now. I'm telling you for your own benefit. All right. Now, in other terms, is cancellation effective upon receipt? I mean, you can put that here. If you can't fill this out, for example, because I realized when I was filling this form out that they made an error. This is not editable in the software, which is a problem. But I thought, okay, no problem. If you put this here, it effectuates the same action. So even if you leave this like this, you could, in an exclusive relationship, this will still effectuate the cancellation immediately upon receipt. So that's why I put the other terms there. Okay, now we move on. And that's the meat of it, right? I mean, this form, so these are all the terms, and this is just the back part of the form right here. This is going to relate to, it's more of just explanatory or the unabridged verbiage that relates to all these provisions up here. So let's go through it. Now, it talks here, by the way, non-exclusive. Remember how I said before that if it's non-exclusive, compensation is only payable if there's broker involvement on a property, but exclusive says that compensation is entitled to you even if your buyer tries to cut you out and they run off with an open house agent. So that's, again, reinforces why you should do exclusive. And then it defines what broker involvement is, because that's a key term. That's a key term for so many reasons. Now, and including continuation of right to compensation. If the buyer cancels or the agreement expires and you still want to get paid on a property in which there was broker involvement. All right, now if you want to read this, feel welcome to. I'm going to scroll through because it just basically explains everything we talked about up on top. We're going to go through it. Of course, both parties are initialing down here. Now it says broker agent initials. It can be the salesperson. It doesn't have to be the designated broker of the office. Okay, mediation clause. All right. Now, if it's exclusive, the buyer must initial here so they acknowledge what's going on. Okay. And if it's an entity, check this box. Entity being it's a trust or an LLC or a corporation. Put that here. Buyer's going to sign. You're going to fill your information out. You're going to sign. Now, I get asked about this all the time. This whole property address. So the question is, how do you put a property address if you haven't even identified a property yet? And the answer is you don't. You leave it blank. This form, see it says 1221. This is an old form that they brought over. They just didn't edit it to change it so that it would accommodate the representation agreement. They just threw in an old form that's part of a normal transaction. So by default, it has this property address on here. Leave it blank or write to be determined, but just ignore it. It's of no consequence. This is just an inspection advisory. Buyer signs. Compensation advisory, disclosures. After the whole C.A.R settlement, everyone's going to be hyper vigilant about this. Okay? Buyer signs, just advisory, disclosure, boring stuff to read to put you to sleep at night. Representation of more than one party. Okay, this is dual agency. Both you and your client are going to sign. Potential for dual agency, I should say, in that it's possible representation of more than one buyer or seller. Could happen, just maybe. Okay, Consumer Privacy Act, buyer signs. Disclosures, advisories, that sort of thing. Okay. Now we come down to this is a form that you can elect to add. Buyer identification of preferences and priorities. I don't like this form because the more that you enter preferences, the more you're narrowing down the scope of what is possible or what your representation agreement might relate to. Why bother? I mean, really, why bother? Now, you could. I'm not saying don't do it, but I wouldn't. I'm just telling you why I wouldn't. Now, some agent might say they have this whole professional presentation where they go, I'm this important buyer's agent and I'm very good at what I do. And for you to work with me, you need to sit down. We need to go through your proof of funds. We need to have a conference call with your lender and we need to fill this form out. And you take them through this whole dog and pony show so that they understand that there's structure and then you're a legitimate professional and they can't just discard you like a diaper. Because in my opinion, many buyers treat buyer's agents like diapers. And the new law, this new requirement is a double-edged sword. On one end, it stinks that we have to have a representation agreement across the board now. I mean, it's state law now. State law, written, by the way, co-sponsored by the Association of Realtors, that even non-realtors must abide by this representation agreement rule. On the flip side, it does force buyers into some sort of structure so they can't flippantly mistreat buyer's agents and have them work for free and then discard them. So if you want to incorporate this as part of your presentation, by all means, go for it. I personally wouldn't. Now this is a little more interesting to me because buyer financial and personal information, because you can elect to include this form as well. And this is good to talk to a buyer about where they're at financially, because they're shopping for a home and you should know this and you should be in communication with their lender. And the buyer should never, ever be in a position where they can fire you from a transaction because they claim, claim highly dubiously, because it's highly subjective whether or not a buyer can afford a property or where the buyer's budget's maxed out. But a buyer can claim, in quotations, that they can't afford your commission and therefore remove you from a transaction. So by having a conversation where you go through this and looking at the proof of funds, that gives them less wiggle room to make up the assertion they can't afford to pay you. So that's it. You can elect to have these two forms. You don't have to have them. I just added them because if you check the box when you're filling out the representation agreement, it automatically populates those forms. So that's it. That's the representation agreement. I'll have plenty more tutorials on other forms because there's all sorts of forms that just came out today, December 18th. And I might do some deep dives on certain provisions within this form because they warrant a further explanation. Hope you found this helpful. Thank you for watching.